Have you ever been betrayed by someone you love? Imagine the crushing weight that falls upon the shoulders of a leader, a man acclaimed for his prowess and his apparent connection to the divine. David, the renowned administrator of Judah and Israel, was not merely a ruler, he was a father. And it is within the bosom of his own household, in the warmth of the home that should have been his refuge, that the most lacerating of wounds would be inflicted. The story we are about to unfold is not only about politics and power, but about the exposed fracture of a father-son relationship, an echo of the complexities that reside in every family, amplified by the magnitude of royalty and the consequences that would shake an entire kingdom. Absalom, his son, bearer of an almost mythical beauty and a charisma that could enchant nations, would become the epicenter of a tempest of ambition and resentment, whose shockwaves would reverberate for generations. Before the torment, however, there was the apparent calm. The days when the young prince grew up under the gaze of the kingdom, perhaps already nurturing in silence the seeds of a dissatisfaction that would later blossom into rebellion. It was a time when David's court pulsed with life, with palace intrigues, certainly, but also with the complex dynamics of a large family, where affections and rivalries intertwined under the watchful and sometimes flawed eye of the patriarch. The pain of a father betrayed by his son is an abyss of particular suffering, a betrayal that not only breaks trust, but shatters the very identity of the one who is attacked by the one to whom he gave life and devoted love. Prepare to delve into the depths of this narrative, where love and heartbreak clash in a duel of tragic consequences, revealing how even the strongest bonds can be corroded when communication fails and the wounds of the soul find no cure. The trajectory of David and Absalom is a perennial reminder of human vulnerability, even for those who seem invincible in the eyes of the world. Every great family tragedy often has its roots in unprocessed pain, in injustices that, left without due attention, morph into inner demons. In the case of Absalom, a deep fissure began to form in his young and proud soul after a terrible event that tarnished his sister Tamar's honor. The violation suffered by Tamar at the hands of her half-brother Amnon was an act of brutality that cried out for justice. David, the father and king, was inflamed with anger at what had occurred, but his response, or the absence thereof in terms of an exemplary and public punishment for Amnon, left a void. For Absalom, this apparent paternal inertia may have been interpreted not only as a failure of David as king, but as a painful negligence as a father, a failure to protect and avenge the blood of his own daughter in a manner satisfactory to the offended brother. This omission, or the perception of it, became fuel for Absalom's resentment, which he harbored for a considerable period, approximately several years, before orchestrating Amnon's murder during a feast. The consummated vengeance, however, brought not peace, but exile. Absalom fled, seeking refuge far from David's reach, and remained there for several annual cycles. The time abroad, rather than appeasing his spirit, seemed only to deepen the shadows of his grief and perhaps to nurture the first sprouts of an ambition that saw in his father's throne a possibility. When he was finally allowed to return, reconciliation with David was belated, and for many observers, and for Absalom himself, possibly superficial, lacking the emotional depth necessary to heal the open wounds. This ceremonial reunion, after a long period of not even being able to contemplate the king's face, did not erase the emotional distance, but only masked it under a fragile layer of formality. The soil was fertile for rebellion to find where to sink its roots. If this journey through human emotions resonates with you, then prepare yourself, because we have much more to unravel together. How about joining our community of explorers of profound narratives by clicking subscribe down below? It's quick and helps us immensely to bring more stories like this, ones that make us think and feel. And speaking of bonds and wounds, up to this point in the story, which feeling or character intrigues you the most or provokes the most intense reflection? Could it be the complexity of David, a flawed leader as a father, or the trajectory of Absalom from indirect victim to architect of revenge and, who knows, a future betrayal? Share your initial perspective in the comments. We'd love to know what this story already awakens in you without right or wrong, just the richness of sharing. With the emotional terrain already mined by resentments and a paternal reconciliation that seemed more like a formality than a true rekindling of bonds, Absalom initiated one of the most astute campaigns of popularity conquest the kingdom had ever witnessed. He did not initially resort to brute force, but rather the subtlety of a charismatic strategist, perceiving the gaps in his father's administration and the latent dissatisfactions in the hearts of the people. Absalom, with his magnetic presence and a beauty that was the subject of songs and conversations, strategically positioned himself at the city gates, the very place where common people sought justice and resolution for their disputes. There, he intercepted citizens heading to the king with their grievances, listening to them with an attention that seemed genuinely empathetic. With carefully chosen words, he sowed doubt about the efficiency of the existing system, lamenting the absence of a more accessible and agile mediator. "Behold, your causes are just and good," he would say, "but there is no one appointed by the king to listen to them properly. Oh, if only I were appointed administrator in this land. Anyone who had a dispute or a matter could come to me, and I would readily do them justice." And he didn't stop at words. He extended his hand, embraced, and even kissed those who bowed before him, gestures of apparent humility and closeness that contrasted with the more distant and majestic figure of King David. In this way, day after day, Absalom not only undermined his father's authority, but, like a skilled weaver of affections, stole the hearts of the men of Israel, building a base of popular support that would be crucial for his future plans. It was a slow-motion betrayal, a silent conspiracy unfolding under the eyes of a kingdom that, in part, allowed itself to be seduced by the promise of younger, more attentive leadership. David's pain, upon eventually perceiving this methodical alienation of popular affection and his son's growing influence, must have been an unspeakable agony, that of seeing the very fruit of his blood actively working to overthrow him, not with swords, but with smiles and promises. After a significant period, perhaps 4 years or more, weaving his web of influence and securing loyalties throughout the territory, Absalom felt the moment was ripe for his final gambit. Under the artful pretext of fulfilling a vow in Hebron, the ancient capital where David himself had been anointed king, Absalom departed from Jerusalem, but his purposes were far more ambitious than any religious ceremony. Hebron became the stage for his self-proclamation as the new king of Israel. News of Absalom's open insurrection reached Jerusalem like a thunderclap from a clear sky for some, but for David, it was perhaps the agonizing confirmation of his deepest fears. The conspiracy, previously subtle and veiled, now materialized into a direct and incontestable threat to his reign and his very life. Confronted with the rapidity of Absalom's ascent and the vast network of support he had cultivated, David, the seasoned military commander and strategist, made a decision that demonstrated both his prudence and the depth of his anguish: to flee Jerusalem. He knew that a battle within the walls of the sacred city would result in a massacre of innocents and the desecration of the place. The image of David, the warrior king who had faced Goliath and won countless battles, now hastily abandoning his capital, is one of the most poignant in the entire narrative. He ascended the Mount of Olives, not as a sovereign in triumph, but as a fugitive, weeping openly, with his head covered in mourning and his feet bare in a show of humility and penitence. His most loyal advisors and the people who remained faithful to him shared in his sorrow, accompanying him in this bitter exodus. To further compound David's suffering, one of his closest and most respected strategic advisors, Ahithophel, whose wisdom was regarded almost as a divine oracle, deserted and joined Absalom, offering the rebellious prince his vast knowledge and prestige. Each step David took away from Jerusalem was a step into the unknown, but also a deeper plunge into the pain of being betrayed by his own son and by those in whom he had placed his trust. The familial division had transformed into civil war. As the nation divided and armies prepared for the inevitable clash, David's heart was a private battlefield, where the duty of a king and the grief of a father waged a relentless war. On one side, the responsibility to restore order, to defend his legitimately constituted throne, and to protect those who remained loyal to him. On the other, the unwavering love for Absalom, the rebellious son, the fruit of his loins who now threatened to destroy all he had built. This duality is perhaps the most tragic aspect of David's position. He was not merely a monarch facing a usurper. He was a father confronting the rebellion of a beloved son, a son for whom, ultimately, he would give his own life. Before his troops departed for the decisive battle against Absalom's forces, David gathered his commanders, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, and before all his soldiers, made an appeal that revealed the depth of his internal conflict and his paternal love. His order was explicit and laden with emotion. "For my sake, deal gently with the young man Absalom." It was not the command of a king thirsting for revenge, but the plea of a father who, even amidst betrayal and war, still cared desperately for his son's well-being. He yearned for the end of the rebellion, for the restoration of his kingdom, but seemed to fear even more the prospect of losing Absalom definitively. This instruction reveals David's complexity. A leader capable of making difficult and strategic decisions, but who, deep down in his soul, remained vulnerable to the love for his offspring, even when that offspring turned against him with fury and ambition. The war that would follow was not just for the crown, but for the fate of a son and the desperate attempt of a father to salvage something amidst the imminent ruin of his family and his legacy. David's anguish was palpable. A dark omen hovering over the fields where the blood of Israelites was about to be spilled. The decisive battle unfolded in the dense and treacherous forest of Ephraim, a terrain that would prove more fatal to Absalom's men than the very swords of David's army. The royal troops, more experienced and under the command of astute generals, inflicted a heavy defeat upon the rebels. 20,000 men, or a number close to that magnitude, were said to have perished that day. But the narrative's focus, and certainly the focus of David's concern, was on a single man, Absalom. The rebellious prince, in his desperate flight amidst the chaos of battle, was riding his mule when, ironically, what was considered one of his greatest attributes of beauty, his long, luxuriant hair, became the instrument of his downfall. While passing beneath the intertwined branches of a great oak or terebinth tree, his vast head of hair became so entangled that the mule continued on its way, leaving Absalom suspended between heaven and earth, alive but completely vulnerable. It was a soldier of David's army who found him in this predicament, and mindful of the king's order to treat Absalom with leniency, hesitated to act and rushed to inform Joab, David's ruthless military chief. Joab, however, was a pragmatic man and perhaps less sentimental than his king. To him, Absalom alive represented a continuing threat to the stability of the kingdom and to David's life. Disregarding the sovereign's express command, Joab took some darts and, finding Absalom still hanging and defenseless, pierced his heart. His armor-bearers then completed the act, ensuring the prince's death. Victory was sealed for David. The rebellion had been crushed, but at a cost that the king did not yet fully comprehend. Absalom's fate, so tragic and ironic, was fulfilled not by the direct hand of his father, but as a consequence of a chain of events unleashed by his own ambition and the harsh realities of war, where the dictates of a paternal heart are often silenced by the brutal pragmatism of the battlefield. As the dust of battle settled and messengers raced to bring news to King David, who waited anxiously between the city gates of Mahanaim, the tension was almost unbearable. For David, the outcome of the war, the survival of his reign, seemed secondary to the question that burned in his chest. When the first messenger, Ahimaaz, arrived, breathless but exultant with victory, David cut him off, his voice laden with an urgency that transcended politics. "Is the young man Absalom safe? Is he all right?" Ahimaaz, perhaps out of fear or not knowing the details of the death, gave an evasive answer. Soon after, another messenger arrived, a Cushite, who also announced the victory over the king's enemies. Again, David's piercing question, "Is the young man Absalom safe and sound?" This time, the answer was more direct, though still veiled in a certain respectful formality. "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you to harm you meet the same fate as that young man." The meaning was unmistakable. Absalom was dead. The realization of this truth struck David with the force of a cataclysm. The king, the warrior, the psalmist crumbled. The military victory transformed into an overwhelming personal defeat. Deeply shaken, David went up to the chamber over the gate, and there, alone with his grief, he allowed his anguish to overflow in a lament that would echo through the centuries. A cry that encapsulates the most excruciating pain a father can feel. He wept, and as he paced back and forth, his choked voice repeated incessantly, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! If only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" There was no king celebrating the defeat of a traitor, but only a father devastated by the loss of his son, a son who, despite all his faults and the pain he had caused, was still loved with a visceral intensity. That lament was not only for Absalom, but perhaps for all the failures, all the unspoken words, all the missed opportunities for reconciliation that now weighed on his soul like mountains. Absalom's death marked the end of the rebellion, but not the end of David's suffering, nor did it erase the deep scars left on the fabric of the nation and, above all, on the soul of the king. The story of David and Absalom transcends the account of a dynastic dispute. It is immortalized as a mirror of the most painful complexities of human relationships, especially family ties. From it, we extract bitter yet necessary lessons. We learn about the corrosive power of unresolved resentment, which, like an infection, can spread and consume even the closest relationships, turning love into bitterness and loyalty into betrayal. We see the devastating danger of unbridled ambition when it is not tempered by wisdom and respect, capable of blinding an individual to the point of destroying those who should be their greatest allies. However, amidst so much pain and error, the narrative also poignantly illuminates the almost unfathomable depth of parental love. A love that, like David's, can persist even in the face of the cruelest betrayal, longing for the well-being of the child until the last moment and lamenting their loss with a pain that seems insurmountable. The consequences of that conflict were vast, requiring a Herculean effort from David to reunify a fractured kingdom and to deal with the personal grief that undoubtedly haunted him for the rest of his days. The memory of Absalom, the handsome and rebellious son, certainly remained as a wound that never fully healed in the heart of the old king. This saga invites us to look into our own lives, into our relationships, and to ponder the importance of dialogue, forgiveness, both asking for and granting it, and the humility to recognize our faults before they generate impassable chasms. If this story struck a chord within you, if it sparked reflection or evoked emotion, know that this space is yours, a place for us to explore the depths of the human experience together. We would be delighted to have you join us, growing and learning in community. How about becoming part of our family here on the channel? A click on the subscribe button fills us with joy and propels us to continue this journey of discovery. And speaking of family and stories, how did this narrative resonate with you? Perhaps it evoked a personal experience or one of someone you know about the challenges of familial bonds, the pain of misunderstanding, or the difficulty of forgiveness. Feel free to share in general terms, respecting everyone's privacy. Or perhaps you gleaned a particular lesson, a new perspective on these intensely human characters. Share your impressions, your reflections, your questions in the comments below. We are eager to hear your voice, cultivate this conversation, and learn from one another. Did you enjoy this immersion in the story of David and Absalom? What stood out to you the most or surprised you? Your feedback is our guiding light, directing us to bring content that truly inspires and connects. Thank you for joining us on this journey.